Mom, where are they taking all the girls in this village to?
Quiet, Amma, you can't say that. It's tradition. The girls are being taken to the shrine.
Tradition. But they never come back. How is that tradition, Mom?
Amma, bring your voice down. Every 7 years, the chief priest chose a loyal maiden from this village. She will be given to the goddess as a gift.
Gift. I won't go into that shrine even though I am chosen.
Amma, no one is allowed to speak against the will of the goddess. Keep your mouth shut. I don't want them to take you away from me.
Every 7 years, our village chooses a girl for the river shrine, and by morning, she is gone forever. The elders call it a blessing. The villagers call it tradition. But when I was 8 years old, I watched a girl scream and beg for her life as they dragged her into that shrine, and that was the day I realized something terrible was hiding behind our village prayers. My name is Oma. And when they finally came to choose me, I refused. The day they came for Oma, the whole village was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that sits heavy on your chest, the kind that makes dogs hide under houses and birds stop singing. Amma was standing in her mother's kitchen, stirring
wonderful.
a pot of beans,
Just
when
a
she
little
heard the
more
drums. 3 slow beats. Then silence. Then 3 more. She did not need anyone to explain what those drums meant. She had been hearing them in her nightmares since she was 6 years old. She set the wooden spoon down slowly, and something inside her, something she had been building for years like a wall, brick by brick, went completely still. Amma was 16 years old, and she was not like other girls in the village of Koro. From when she was small, she noticed things. She noticed how the older women would go quiet whenever the shrine was mentioned. She noticed how fathers would look away when the priest walked past. She noticed how nobody ever asked where the chosen girls went, not really. They would say, the river goddess has accepted her, and then change the subject fast, like they were turning off a lamp in a dark room. Amma was the child who kept turning that lamp back on. But where does she go, she would ask. But why does she never come back? But why is it always a girl? The adults would look at her with tired, scared eyes and tell her to hush. But Amma never learned how to hush. Her mother, Efua, had warned her 100 times. Amma, this village has rules older than your grandmother's grandmother. You do not fight a river with your hands. But Amma would look at her mother and say, then what do we fight it with, Mama? Efua never had an answer for that. What she did have was fear, the kind of fear that lives so long in a person's body that it starts to feel like love, like respect, like tradition. She loved her daughter so much it hurt to look at her sometimes. And she prayed every single night, quietly, with her hands pressed together, that when the priest came to choose, they would pass their house. For 10 years, they had passed. But not this time. The drums beat again. Then the chief priest, a tall man named Oduro, appeared at their door. He wore white cloth and carried a carved wooden staff. Behind him stood 4 men, also in white, their faces blank and serious. Efua dropped the cup she was holding. It shattered on the floor and nobody moved to pick it up. Oduro looked past Efua like she was a curtain, and his eyes landed on Oma. He said 4 words that were supposed to sound like an honor. She has been chosen. The room felt like it tilted sideways. Efua grabbed the doorframe. But Oma did not grab anything. She looked straight at Oduro, and in a voice that did not shake even a little, she said, no. Before we continue, if you enjoy emotional African stories filled with mystery, tradition, suspense, and powerful life lessons, make sure you subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell, because this story will leave you shocked. To understand why that one word shook the entire village, you have to understand what Koro was built on. Not soil. Not water. Fear. The tradition had started so long ago that nobody alive could say exactly when, and that was part of its power. Things without beginnings feel like they have always been true. The elder said that many generations ago, the river flooded so badly that half the village drowned. Then a priest went to the river and made an offering, and the flood stopped. The crops grew again. Children stopped dying. And so the people believed, if you feed the river protects you. And the offering, they decided, had to be young, had to be female, had to be innocent. That was the deal they made with something they could not see. Every 7 years, the priest would spend months watching the village girls. They never said they were watching. They came to bless the households. They came to pray over the children. But Omar had always known they were measuring. Measuring who was old enough, who was healthy enough, who had the face that would make the village feel like the river was being given something precious. The girls chosen before Omar had all been beautiful, quiet, and obedient. Families whose daughters were chosen were given land and grain for a year. The village called it an honor. But Omar had watched those families. She had seen what lived behind their grateful smiles, grief so deep it had no bottom. She remembered a girl named Sawa, chosen 3 years before Omar's time. Sawa had a laugh that sounded like a pot of coins shaking. She used to save mango seeds and plant them in rows behind her house. She told Omar once, "When these trees grow big, I give you the first fruit every season." The trees grew. Sawa did not. The morning she was taken to the shrine, she was dressed in white with flowers in her hair, and the village sang for her. Her mother sang too, loud and clear, with tears running straight down her face that she did not wipe away. After that day, nobody said Sawa's name out loud anymore. It was like she had been erased. That erasure burned inside Omar like a coal that never cooled. There was something else Omar had noticed, something she had never told anyone. The shrine was sealed from the outside. She had crept close to it once, at night, years before she was chosen. She had pressed her ear to the old stone wall. And she had heard something. Not prayers. Not water. Not the voice of any goddess. She had heard men's voices, low and careful, and the sound of things being moved around inside. She had run home that night and lain awake till morning, her heart pounding, asking herself one question over and over: what is really in that shrine? Whatever it wasn't the goddess. She was sure of that. And she promised herself, even then, that she would find out the truth, or die trying. When Omar said no to Oduro, the village did not explode. It went colder. Oduro looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, but with something worse, the patient look of someone who knows they always win in the end. He told Efua that the ceremony would take place in 3 days. That Omar would have time to prepare her spirit. Then he and the men in white left without another word. The moment they were gone, Efua shut the door and slid to the floor. She was shaking so hard the beads on her wrist made noise. "Omar," she whispered. "Please. Please just go. They say the goddess gives them peace. Maybe it is beautiful on the other side." "Maybe, Mama," Omar said quietly. "You do not believe that?" Efua said nothing. And her silence was the loudest thing Omar had ever heard. That night, neighbors came. Some came with food, yam, soup, cloth, the gifts you bring when you have nothing useful to say. Some came to pray with Efua. One woman came just to hold Efua's hand in silence for an hour. Nobody looked Omar in the eye. She sat in the corner and watched all of it, the performance of acceptance, and she felt something harden inside her like clay in the sun. She was not going to let this village swallow her. She was not going to disappear and become a name that nobody spoke anymore. She was not going to become another girl who planted mango seeds and never saw them grow. On the second night, when the house was finally quiet and her mother had cried herself to sleep, Omar moved. She had been planning quietly, carefully, in the back of her mind for hours. She wrapped 2 changes of clothes in a cloth. She took the small amount of money her mother had hidden under the floorboard, money Efua had been saving for years without saying why, as if some quiet part of her had always known this day would come. Omar took it and felt guilty and grateful at the same time. She looked at her mother sleeping on the mat, her face still wet from tears, her chest rising and falling slowly. Amma pressed her lips to her mother's forehead and stayed there for one long breath. Then she straightened up, tied the bundle on her back, and walked out of the house without looking back. Because she knew that if she looked back, she would not leave. She moved through the village in the dark, quiet as smoke. She knew every path, every shortcut, every dog that barked and everyone that didn't. She reached the edge of the village where the road to the city began, a road she had never walked before but had stared at 100 times from a distance. She stopped there for just a moment. Behind her, she could hear the river, or thought she could. It always made a low sound at night, like it was breathing. She turned her back on that sound and started walking forward. She walked all night. By morning, the village of Koro was gone behind her, and the rest of the world was just beginning to appear in the light ahead. The city hit Amma like a wall of noise. Everything moved too fast, buses, people, voices, lights blinking at every corner. She had never seen this many strangers in one place. Nobody looked at her. Nobody offered help. In the village, even enemies greeted you in the morning. Here, people walked past each other like they were invisible. For the first 3 days, Amma slept on the steps of a market building, wrapped in her cloth, her bundle tucked under her head. She was hungry, and she was terrified, but she refused to cry. She told herself, "You didn't run from one trap to fall into another. Think. Observe. Move." On the 4th day, she found work in a food store run by a stout woman named Auntie B. Auntie B had a loud voice, sharp eyes, and absolutely no patience for laziness, but she had one thing Amma needed more than food: she was fair. She paid what she promised. She didn't cheat. She gave Amma a mat in the back room and 1 meal a day. It wasn't comfort, but it was solid ground, and Amma held onto solid ground with both hands. She worked before sunrise and after dark. She scrubbed pots until her fingers ached. She memorized prices and orders, and she never, not once, kept money that didn't belong to her. Auntie B noticed. Over the next 2 years, things slowly changed. Auntie B let Amma run the stall on days she was sick. Then she enrolled her in an evening school nearby, because a sharp girl with no education is like a good knife with no handle, she said. Amma took to school the way dry ground takes to rain, fast and deep. She studied harder than anyone. Not because school was easy, but because she understood what education really was. It was a door. And she had come from a place where girls were never given doors, only walls. She read everything she could find. She listened more than she spoke. She was building something inside herself, and she was patient about it, the way you are patient when you know exactly what you are building toward. By the time she was 20, Amma had finished secondary school at the top of her class. She had saved enough to rent a small room of her own. Auntie B cried the day she moved out, then immediately offered her a job managing the whole food store. Amma smiled and said she would think about it. But she already knew her path was going somewhere else. It was around this time that she walked into an office she had passed many times, a building with a blue door and a sign that said, "Voice for the Voiceless, Human Rights Organization." She had walked past it dozens of times. That day, for the first time, she went inside. The woman behind the desk at Voice for the Voiceless was named Dr. Mensah. She was small and wore glasses and had the kind of calm face that made you feel like nothing could surprise her. Amma walked in and said simply, "I come from a village where they take girls to a shrine every 7 years and those girls never come back. I want to stop it." Dr. Mensah looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "Sit down." That conversation lasted for hours. By the end of it, Amma was not just a girl with a story, she was a witness, a source, a case. Voice for the Voiceless was a small but powerful organization that documented cases of harmful traditional practices and brought them to light, through media, through courts, through communities. They had investigators, lawyers, journalists, and people who understood how to turn personal pain into public truth. For the first time in her life, Oma was surrounded by people who believed that the things she had always known were wrong were actually wrong, not just to her, but by the standards of every law that existed. She cried the first night after her first full day there. Not from sadness. From relief. The relief of being understood. She spent the next 3 years working with the organization. She trained as a community investigator. She learned how to document testimonies safely, how to speak to authorities, how to protect sources. She traveled to other villages with similar practices and sat with women who had lost daughters, sisters, nieces. She held their hands and recorded their words, and she never once looked away from their pain, because she had carried the same pain herself. She became very good at her work. Not because it was easy, but because she was doing it for Sawa. For the girl who planted mango seeds and never saw them grow. For every name that had been erased. Then one evening, she received something that changed everything. A letter, delivered through a network contact, from inside Koro. The handwriting was shaky and the paper was old, but the words were sharp and clear. It was from a man named Kofi, a former assistant to the chief priest, who was old now and sick and said he could not die with his secret. He wrote, "I know what happens in the shrine. I have known for 20 years. And it is not what they tell you." Oma read that letter 3 times. Then she looked up at the ceiling and made a quiet, steady promise to herself. It was time to go back. If this story is touching your heart already, don't forget to subscribe and tell me in the comments, do you think Oma was right to fight against the tradition, or should she have obeyed the village elders? Returning to Koro was nothing like leaving it. When she left, she was a barefoot girl in the dark, running for her life. When she returned, she came with Dr. Mensah beside her, 2 investigators behind her, a journalist with a recording device, and a letter from a regional authority granting them permission to conduct an inquiry. She dressed simply, no flash, no show. She didn't need to impress anyone. She already knew who she was. The village looked smaller than she remembered. The roads were the same red clay, the same mango trees, the same river sound at every turn. But some things had changed. There were more children than before, which should have been good news, but Oma noticed quickly that there were very few girls between the ages of 12 and 17. She asked quietly and was told, one by one, their names. Some had moved away. Some had married young. And 2 had been accepted by the river in the years since Oma left. 2 more girls. 2 more names about to be forgotten. The anger in Oma's chest was old and familiar, like a cold that never could, but it was focused now, controlled, aimed. Her mother, Efua, saw her from the doorway of the same house and did not move for a full minute. Then she walked forward slowly, like someone who was afraid the vision would disappear, and wrapped both arms around Oma and held on so tight that Oma could feel her mother's heartbeat. Neither of them spoke. Efua looked at her daughter's face, touched her cheek, looked at the people behind her, and then looked back at Oma with eyes that held 2 things at once, pride and terror. "They were not like this," Efua whispered. "I know, Mama," Oma said. "They never liked me." "That's all right." When the elders heard that Oma had returned with outsiders and documents and questions, the village split in 2 immediately. Some people pulled their doors shut and refused to speak. Others came out quietly, slowly, with their eyes low, and they began to talk. First in whispers. Then in full voices. Women who had sent daughters to the shrine. Fathers who had stood at ceremonies with their hearts breaking. Young girls who had been told to be ready, just in case. They spoke and the investigators wrote everything down. And in the middle of all this, Oma asked to see the old man Kofi, the one who had sent the letter, because it was finally time to hear the truth. Kofi was 63 years old and had the look of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. He lived alone in a small house at the edge of the village, away from everyone, as if he was punishing himself by staying just close enough to see what he had helped build. When Omar sat across from him, he could barely look at her. He kept his eyes on the floor and twisted his hands together. "I was young when I started," he said. "I told myself I was serving tradition. I told myself it was sacred." He stopped. Omar waited. Patient. Steady. "What happened in the shrine, Kofi?" she said quietly. Kofi explained everything slowly, painfully, like pulling out thorns one by one. The shrine was not a place of worship. It was a passage, a hidden tunnel that led to a separate location far from the village, deep in the forest. The girls who were taken by the goddess were not killed. They were taken through the tunnel and delivered to a group of men from another region, men who had paid for them. Girls, young and healthy and with no family to chase after them because their families had been told to grieve and accept. Sold. That was the truth. That was what the chief priest had been doing for generations, with the help of a small group of men who benefited from the payments. The sacred tradition was nothing but a cover, a story dressed in white cloth and drums and flowers, designed so perfectly that even the people who might have questioned it were silenced by their own belief. Amma sat very still while Kofi spoke. She did not cry. She had cried enough for this truth years ago, in the dark, without even knowing exactly what the truth was. She had known in her bones that something was wrong, and the full ugliness of it now just made her more certain that running away had been the right thing, that coming back was the right thing, that everything she had built herself into was exactly what this moment required. When Kofi finished, he looked up at her finally. His eyes were wet. "I am sorry," he said. "I am so sorry." Oma looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Tell it all again." Into the recorder. Every name. Every detail. Say it all. He did. He talked for 2 hours. By the time he finished, the investigator's recorder was full and Dr. Mensah had filled an entire notebook. They had names of the men involved. They had dates. They had the location of the tunnel. They had a former insider's full testimony. It was enough. It was more than enough. That night, as Oma walked back through the village under a sky full of stars, she thought about Sawa and her mango trees. She thought about all the names. And she made them a quiet promise: "You will not be forgotten anymore. I will say your names until the whole world hears them." What happened next moved fast. The regional authorities arrived 2 days later. The shrine was officially opened, not with ceremony or drums, but with officers and torches. The hidden tunnel was found exactly where Kofi had described, behind a false wall in the back of the shrine, carved carefully into the stone so that if you didn't know it was there, you would never find it. The village stood outside and watched the officers go in. Some faces showed shock. Some showed something that looked like relief, the relief of a secret that has been held too long finally leaving the body like a fever breaking. Oduro, the chief priest, was arrested. So were 3 elders who had been part of the arrangement for years. Oduro said nothing when the officers came for him. He walked with his staff and his white cloth and his chin up, like a man performing dignity he did not own anymore. The village watched him go. And this time, it was not the quiet of obedience. It was the quiet of something ending. You could feel it in the air, something old and rotten being pulled out by its roots at last. The journalists published the full story. It spread first across the region, then further. The names of the girls who had been taken, the ones they could trace, were recorded and read aloud in a public gathering that Oma organized at the center of the village. One by one. Name by name. Some families wept. Some simply closed their eyes and listened. When Sawa's name was read, Oma said it herself, into the microphone, clearly and slowly. Then she stepped back and let the silence hold it for a moment. A woman in the crowd, Sawa's mother, old now and bent, put both hands over her mouth and made a sound that no words could describe. Omar went to her and held her. And they stayed like that for a long time. Not everyone in the village accepted what had happened easily. There were some who called Omar a troublemaker, who said she had brought outsiders into their home and destroyed something sacred. Omar listened to them. She did not argue. She understood that belief, once planted deep enough, does not leave even when the truth arrives. But she also knew that truth is stubborn enough to outlast denial, to outlast shame, to outlast silence. She had been stubborn about the truth since she was 6 years old, and she was not going to stop now. 3 months after the arrest, Omar stood at the center of Koro for the last time, or at least the last time as an investigator with a case to close. The shrine had been sealed permanently by the authorities. A sign was placed over the entrance, not a dramatic one, just a plain board with official writing, but to Omar, it was the most important sign she had ever seen. It meant, "This ends here." A small group of villagers gathered around her that morning. Not the whole village, not everyone had come around. But enough. Women, mostly. Some young girls who had watched everything unfold from behind curtains and corners. A few men with quiet eyes. An old woman named Mama Didi, who had lived in the village longer than anyone and had kept quiet about the shrine for all those years, came to Omar that morning with something in her hands. It was a mango seed. Dry and rough, worn smooth at the edges like it had been held many times. "This was Sawa's," she said, her voice barely a sound. "She gave it to me the morning they came for her. She said, 'Keep it until someone plants it properly.'" She pressed it into Omar's palm and closed her fingers around it. Omar looked down at the seed in her hand and could not speak for a full minute. They planted it that afternoon, Omar, her mother Efua, Sawa's mother, and a circle of women and girls from the village. They chose a spot near the river, in the open, where the sun came through cleanly. The ground was soft and the earth accepted the seed easily, the way the earth always accepts what is placed into it with care. Nobody sang the old songs. They didn't need them. Someone hummed something quiet and simple and a few other voices joined softly, and that was enough. Efua held Omar's arm as they pressed the soil down. Omar felt her mother's hands, rough and warm and shaking slightly, and she held them still. Before she left Koro for the last time that evening, Omar walked back to the sealed shrine alone. She stood in front of it for a moment. The stone was old and the wall was thick and it had held its secret for decades. But secrets, she knew, are not permanent. They only feel permanent when no one is brave enough to ask questions. She thought of the little girl she had been, small, barefoot, pressing her ear to this same wall in the dark, hearing men's voices and knowing in her whole body, that something was wrong. That girl had not been mistaken. That girl had been right all along. Omar put her hand flat against the cold stone, not in grief, not in anger, but in acknowledgement. Then she turned around and walked away. Behind her, the mango tree was already in the ground, invisible, but growing. Some things take time to rise. But they rise. If Omar's story moved you, then please subscribe to support more powerful African stories like this. And before you leave, comment one word that describes Omar: brave, stubborn, fearless, or something else. I'll be reading your comments.